So this is my third in a long line of book talks that are of this sort that are scheduled through the rest of the year, which means that on the one hand you'll get relatively fresh material, and on the other hand probably less polished than when I will give the same talk a few months from now. So it's a trade-off. The story of the book, which in one sentence, is my story of why I came from absolute unbelief to being received into the Catholic Church in December 2016. I'll tell you some of it here, of course not the whole book, but it's a book that recounts both a geographic journey from Iran and the Middle East to the West and the United States, but also across the boundaries of lots of different kinds of ideas and enthusiasms that end in Catholicism. I was born in Tehran, Iran. 6 years to the day the Ayatollah Khomeini returned from his Parisian exile to topple the Shah's westernizing, secularizing regime and herald the new Islamic Republic of Iran, which means I'm a child of Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution. Under Khomeini's regime, which celebrated its 40th anniversary last month, God and politics were inextricable. Politics was God in some ways, and God was politics. And oh, how I and most of my family detested that. When I was a boy, my birthday, like I said, February 1st, the 6th anniversary of Khomeini's return in triumph, was the subject of a long-running joke in our family. One of our relatives was this gregarious police colonel under the Shah's regime who not only hated the new regime and had opposed the revolution, but hated Islam itself because he was a sort of strict secularist. And he would always ask me at every family get-together, he'd say, how old are you, Sohrab? Sorry, what was your birthday, Sohrab? And I would play along knowing that he knew that I knew the answer. I would say February 1st, and he'd sort of hold his nose and say, pif, pif, you brought the imam with you, which bore the disagreeable scent of Khomeini. The punchline didn't need explaining because the sentiment was so widely shared in our urbane, educated, middle-class milieu. Having supported the revolution, my family had come to bitterly regret it, almost instantly. The collapse of 2,500 years of monarchy didn't win popular rule for Iran's middle classes, and it made life far more miserable than it had been under the last Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the King of Kings as he was titled. For my maternal grandfather, it was nationalism and anti-Western grievance that lighted the revolutionary spark. He was a mild-mannered civil servant, but he poured into the streets with everyone else and shouted death to the Shah and Allahu Akbar. His father, my great-grandfather, had been elected to the Majlis, or parliament, that was founded at the turn of the 20th century when Iran had a brief constitutional uprising, but the new constitutional order didn't take to Iranian soil, partly because the great powers opposed it, mainly Russia and Britain, but also because, for various reasons, Iran didn't have a culture of self-government. But my grandfather blamed the West, more or less, and outside powers for his own father's failure. He was almost a kind of type who's a Persian character. Some of you, if you know Iranians, you'll know it. Or if you know people from the Middle East, you might know it, that he saw every petty mishap almost, the broken teapot, the missing tobacco, as the work of nefarious outsiders, mainly Britons. So for him, 1979 was about restoring Iran's lost honor after millennia of humiliations at the hands of outsiders going back to, Alexander the Great's conquest of Achaemenid Persia. But for my parents, 1979 held other promises. The Pahlavi monarchs had forged a modern nation-state out of the shambolic remains of the ancient Persian Empire. But like a lot of their fellow boomers after in the post-war period, the development that came post-war and all the sort of consumerist wonders that suddenly flooded Iran actually made them more not restive, and contact with the West only heightened their sense of inadequacy. So they read hot-headed French philosophers and concluded that the answer to their dissatisfactions lay in making revolution, in raising all traditional hierarchies and erecting an entirely new order. But neither the old-school nationalists like my grandfather, nor the secular-minded leftists like my parents had a clear picture of what should come after the fall. But that wasn't the case with Khomeini and his followers, who were thick among the conservative merchants of the bazaar and the pious provincial multitudes. These were people who, through rapid development and urbanization and industrialization under the Shah, had made their way from the provinces to the capital and been horrified by what they found. First of all, because they were suddenly in these close quarters among strangers, as one has to live in a city, but a city which had a tolerated red light district, which the Shah even provided a kind of social welfare program for the prostitutes, which just shows you how far out of touch he was with his own deeply conservative people, which is why I increasingly think that as much as I would have prospered as a young Iranian had the revolution hadn't happened, it was sort of inevitable that he asked for it. Immediately, Khomeini laid the foundations of a total state. He outlawed political parties, purged the institutions, dismantled independent labor unions, summarily executed his erstwhile leftist and secular allies. The hijab became mandatory for women, dancing, drinking, foreign movies, and music, and most other forms of fun were now strictly prescribed. The new Iran was a land of conspiracies and denunciations, wild utopian fantasies, and pervasive dysfunction, where each day began and ended with a litany of the names of the newly executed enemies of the revolution, barked out on state radio by men with mad foghorn voices. So all this led me to conclude at age 12 or 13 that I was an atheist. I remember the circumstances only vaguely. We were on holiday with my parents in northern Iran by the Caspian Sea. Many middle-class Iranians either own villas or have friends who own villas, which was the case with our family, so we went to the beach. At most public beaches, the regime curtained off the water for vast distances to create distinct areas for the two sexes. At most public beaches, said that, and everywhere there were banners and posters that read, "My sister, mind your veil. My brother, mind your eyes." But my parents and their friends usually found hidden corners where men and women could share the beach away from the watchful eyes of the Islamic Republic's morality police. They would even bring bottles of arak, or arak, as you know, Iran's searing homemade spirit, in defiance of official prohibition. Now, if the morality police showed up in their signature Toyota 4x4s, all wasn't lost. You may have heard that drinking in Iran is against the law, and it is. Because Sharia law forms the basis of Iran's penal code, drinking is actually punishable by flogging. But that doesn't mean that every person who drinks and is caught ends up getting flogged. More often than not, the officers, the agents of the morality police, are quite pliable. You can give them $20 and apologize and vow never to do it again, and they'll leave you alone. So the officers would say, after you pleaded with them for a bit, they would say, "Well, if you're having such a good time, give us a taste of your candy." And that was the code for the men to pool their cash and pay off typically the provincial officers, although there was always a non-zero chance that the officer in charge was a true believer. And then you could end up getting a flogging that made your back look permanently like challah bread. One night during that summer of 1997, in the borderland between childhood and pubescence, I began thinking seriously for the first time about all this. And religion, I concluded, right then and there, was little more than a ritual of public hypocrisy, and one that I'd be expected to perform. Well, not if I could help it. It helped, have I declared myself an atheist and was staying in Iran, I could get myself in a lot of trouble, but partly, I think my boldness came from the fact that I knew that we were about to get a green card, because then I had an uncle who had settled in the U.S. many years earlier, and green cards were on their way, and that gave me a sense of abandon. So I said, "There is no God," and I sort of cursed God, and I said, "Well, if I curse Almighty God, we'll see if I get zapped." And in a cartoonish way. Or there'll be demons who sort of will instantly appear and take me to the netherworld. But it didn't happen. Nothing happened. That doesn't mean that I didn't get zapped. It just wasn't a cartoonish zap. There was more to it than that, of course. Living in an Islamic theocracy where God appears in the forms of floggings and judicial amputations, scowling ayatollahs and secret police has a way of souring you on things divine. Years later, I read a wise young Iranian dissident who argued that if the Islamic Republic collapsed one day, it would leave behind the world's largest community of atheists. And unfortunately, I think he's right. My turn away from God then had something to do with the nature of Islam, of the Islam of Khomeini's followers, a religion that never proposes but only imposes, and that by the sword of the suicide bomber or the Kalashnikov-wielding fanatic. Across wide swaths of the Islamic world, the religion of Muhammad is synonymous with law and political dominion without love or mercy. As the French philosopher Pierre Manon has written, Islam is a, quote, starkly objective faith, where it spreads a set of authoritative norms and a political community follow. To assent to the law and to the community is to assent to Islam. There is little room for the individual conscience and free will, for reason and intellect in that assent. So there I was, again, as I said, in a little villa on the Caspian, cursing God and professing my disbelief in him. I cursed the God who required a police state to enforce his whims, but whose agents were so willing to cut corners for the right price. But as I said, no cartoonish demons ever came to take me away after I pronounced my disbelief. It would take me years, decades even, to notice that I had been dragged, or I had dragged myself into a netherworld of a kind. No cartoonish demons inhabited, but there were demons, and it was a netherworld all the same. Not long after that, as I said, I migrated to the West with my mother, and the miseries of that unbelief inflicted on me would eventually take me to a small chapel in central London where I would be received into the Roman Catholic Church on December 19, 2016, with detours through Nietzsche, Camus, Sartre, Marxism-Leninism, postmodernism, post-structuralism, and a brief spell of evangelical Christianity. So how did I get from the place where I started to the place where I ended? Well, that's the story I tell in full in my memoir, From Fire by Water. But for our purposes, I want to highlight one thing that led me from a very dark spiritual and intellectual place to the grace and order that I found in the Catholic Church, for that's what Catholicism really is. It's how I define it. It's grace and order in perfect harmony. And that, for me, comes down to listening to the prophets in my life. If you think back to your own lives, you can probably identify prophets. I don't mean biblical prophets, but real-life prophets who either moved you, who spoke truths that you least wanted to hear when you least wanted to hear them, or who you called to you to be your best self. And most often than not, they don't come with a T-shirt or a hat that says prophet across it. For me, one important prophetic influence was my Teach for America roommate. This is years after I'd immigrated to the US. His name was Yossi. It's not his real name. After college, I joined Teach for America because I had vague ideas about putting my idealism, at the time, really I was a Marxist, really a believing Marxist, into action. And because I had really no idea what to do in my life, and joining an elite teacher corps sounded good, I guess, in an abstract sense. Yossi was a 22-year-old Israeli-American who had joined TFA from the University of Pennsylvania. English wasn't his first language, yet he spoke it eloquently, albeit with a heavy Israeli accent, which I won't try to imitate for your sake and mine. He wasn't a child of privilege. He'd hustled to put himself through the Ivy League, and we bonded over the fact that neither of us could stand the TFA diversity training regimen, which kind of asked each of us to be victims in a pre-written kind of code. This was where intersectionality was still an elite phenomenon. It wasn't something that celebrities would talk about casually, saying like, I just want to be intersectional about this. It was something that had begun to filter down from the academy into everyday life, certainly in Teach for America. But it never applied to me, because the role that I was expected to play was as the oppressed Muslim in post 9/11 America, but I'd never been oppressed as a Muslim. The worst, I guess, was sometimes when I sensed that interaction was uncomfortable, I would say, I come from the heart of the axis of evil. That was it. And it diffused situations. So Yossi would fume in these sessions, and his voice would squeak, and he punctuated his comments with wild hand gestures that instantly recalled the region of the world we both hailed from. And it happened that we were set to teach at the same middle school in Brownsville, Texas, right on the border. And when the training over, the two of us moved into a house together, and he and I were to teach at the same school as well. He was hired to teach English, and I had checked a box on my Teach for America application saying that I was willing to teach special education, whatever. I had no idea what it meant to deal with kids with dyslexia or autism or behavioral disorders, but what I lacked in expertise, I more than made up for with the carpetbagger's smugness. And Yossi could be prone to similar snobbery, that sense that we're outsiders here to save this community. But he also spent every waking hour making sure that his kids could read and write at or above grade level. He would get to his class before dawn and stay long till after the final bell, and there weren't enough hours during the regular day for all the grading and assessing and mentoring and lesson planning that he felt he needed to do. And when he returned home at night, his clothes would be soaked with sweat. He would never come out for drinks, or only rarely, no matter how much the rest of us cajoled him. The same couldn't be said for me. Being an effective special ed teacher, I quickly realized needs you to be in very close collaboration with regular education teachers, and I just despaired at the enormity of the problem. So usually my aides and I just ended up doing the work for our kids, which, as some of you would know, it defeats the whole purpose of special education, which is to transmit the same knowledge and skills, albeit in modified form, to students with disabilities. But when the final bell rang, I drove straight home, having left my students no better or no worse than they had been without me. I spent much of the first year of my stint going to bars and chasing hookups. And oddly enough, though, at the school, I was the one who was seen as like the star new hire, and Yossi was seen as a problematic new teacher, because I very quickly realized you could just fake a great game in a like a faculty meeting, raise your hand and be like, yes, I've been developing instructional strategies. And Yossi wasn't like that. He actually demanded things of his kids and set very high expectations. And the school would have preferred him to pass his kids, even if they hadn't learned, but he would insist, to the point where he almost came close to being fired. And I said, dude, don't you want to go to Harvard Law? He already had been admitted to Harvard Law pre-admission, and then they'd given him time off to do his Teach for America stint. And I said, wouldn't it look bad if you had to then disclose to Harvard that you'd been let go from his job? So why not ease up a bit? And he would just say, because then I'd be lying. So weeks and months passed by, and he wasn't fired. He stood his ground, and in the end, it was the school that had to bend to his will rather than the other way around. And by then, I was utterly in awe of this roommate. It really was the case that even in the direst classrooms, teachers could make tremendous gains with students by emphasizing hard work, honesty, tough discipline. But there was much more to it than that. His refusal to countenance a lie, no matter how inconvenient the truth, marked a milestone in my own moral education. Again, I was 20 years old at this point. So I resolved to pour myself into the job as well. I didn't always manage it. Indeed, more often than not, I failed. But even the thought, as well as the attendant anguish when I fell short of these daily vows, were new for me. Now, all this may not sound like an earth-shattering realization for you, but it was for me. It suggested that there were gradations of character in all human circumstances, that there was great value to old moralistic notions I used to sneer at, and that there were permanent things about what made people tick. And I would see the difference because I would travel with the special education students to their regular ed classrooms, and I would compare the teachers. And some of them, would be buried behind their computer, and spitballs would be flying all the time. And they would get frustrated and yell, and the kids would quiet down for a second, but then even the outbursts of the teacher made them misbehave even more. Whereas Yossi's classroom, he shook their hands every day with a firm handshake in the beginning. He set very high expectations, and they constantly knew where they were in relation to his expectations, and they loved it. They loved order. So character and virtue, I concluded, precedes material circumstances. At the time, as a Marxist, as you again will know, Marxists think that the things people say and do, what they believe, the moral code they espouse, is a product of material circumstances and political, the balance of forces in a particular society. The ideologies I had promoted and wallowed in at that point, up until that point, put the cart before the horse. People and their conduct weren't reducible to language, race, class, and collective identities. There was something more in the virtuous, the capacity to recognize the good and a desire to spread it around them and to bring order where disorder prevailed. The kids grasped the passion for order in teachers like Yossi, and they reacted accordingly. Indeed, you could have teleported his classroom to a country in, say, East Asia, and an unbiased observer, even one who spoke a different language, would have felt compelled to say that teacher is pursuing order and excellence. And the lesson held across life's realms. And I'm almost done. In TFA circles, Yossi had a reputation for honesty and constancy. He was a trustworthy friend to whom one could turn in happiness or distress. By contrast, I probably came across as selfish, aloof, imperious. It may have been fun to shoot the philosophical breeze with me over a bottle of wine, but no one would say of me, there's a man you can rely on. When I subjected myself to this kind of interior scrutiny, as I was beginning to do, I had to admit that the impression reflected an underlying truth, and these character contrasts in turn implied the existence of a universal standard of good conduct, an objective morality. In my case, awareness of that standard arose not from an external source, but from a voice, more often a whisper, inside. Well, where did that voice or whisper originate? And was it a coincidence that my former worldview, the one that said morality is merely a function of power, history, biology, language, and so forth, gave me an alibi for shutting out the whisper and its remonstrances when they became inconvenient? In time, the search for answers to these questions would force me to think deeply about the phenomenon of conscience. The voice inside that urged me to do good and shun evil, I would conclude, gave unimpeachable testimony to the existence of a personal God, indeed of the God of the Bible. But not yet. The rest you'll have to read the book for. Thank you very much.
So has Yossi read the book?
No. I've gotten in touch with him because we lost touch after our Teach for America stint. But now I'll have to send him the book.
Yeah, that would be
yes.
Definitely with the little thank you note.
Yeah, he'll love it, obviously.
Well, and
I mean, his portrait. I don't know if he'll like the book, but
right.
That's what I mean.
He comes off well in it.
Yes.
And it is testimony to what Paul VI and John Henry Newman and others have said. The world needs more witnesses rather than necessarily lecturers. But you mentioned the chapel in London. Tell us a little bit more about the pull that you felt there, how the Eucharist and liturgy were real key to your conversion.
Yes. So there was the intellectual side of my conversion, which was prompted by these experiences that I just discussed, that there's a voice inside me that seems to suggest that there's an objective morality, and I couldn't explain where it came from until I thought about it enough, and I concluded that that voice was the imprint of a supreme being who's the Lord of a moral order. And then I read the Bible, and it seemed to suggest the same thing. You know, that voice is the voice that says to Cain, you know, what have you done? What have you done? Or it says to Adam, where are you, Adam? So that was the intellectual side of it. I read Pope Benedict and this and that. But I had through it all these providential encounters with the Mass, which to secular ears will sound crazy, but which I believe that, you know, our Lord providentially led me to his own Eucharistic presence. And one of them was right here in New York, not long after the experiences that I described here. This was when I was 20. But by the time I was 24, I was now working for Teach for America. I was in New York City, and I'd had just your lousy type of weekend where, not unheard of among 20-somethings to drink too much and just feel, you know, the following day just feel that shame, that sort of how oafish I was. And I was walking around Penn Station waiting for my train to go back to Boston, and I kept circling the same 4-block radius. And as you know, there's a Capuchin monastery near
The Padre Pio shrine.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I walked in just as the Sunday evening Mass was to begin. And so at that point, my sum total of knowledge about Catholicism was I had seen some sacred art and liked it. I had seen the baptism scene in The Godfather, intercut with flashes of mob murder. And that was, I mean, and then I had dipped a bit into the Bible, but I had no idea about what the Catholic Church teaches about what happens in the supernatural action at the heart of the Mass. But I was floored. And this was not the most beautiful Mass, it was just your average whatever, but I was floored nevertheless at the words that constantly spoke about sacrifice, this sort of redemptive sacrifice, on the night he was betrayed. There was something so moving about that, the liturgical prayers, that I was floored and I wept. And that experience got somewhere in my mind, and it led me to read Pope Benedict's books, as I said. Then years later, this is when I'm 31 and I'm living in London, by this point I'd concluded, yes, there's a personal God, yes, he's the God of the Bible, and yes, I want to become a Christian, but I was going to an evangelical church, because Catholics don't invite you to go to Mass, but evangelicals do. Usually they don't.
Invite someone to go to Mass this weekend.
But the church that I went to, the evangelical one, is called Holy Trinity Brompton, and it's perhaps the most important evangelical institution in Britain. And it happens to be right next to a church called the Brompton Oratory, which is famous for beautiful liturgy. And so one day on my way back from the evangelical church, I saw a notice for a high solemn Latin Mass, and I just walked in. And this reactivated all those sort of docile and loving feelings I had for that earlier Mass, only this one was so grand. And to me, the idea that beauty and truth are interlinked is clear. And so it wasn't just the bells and smells, because the bells and smells, yes, they were there. They were signs of the truth. So by the end of the Mass, I just said, I have to become a Roman Catholic. And so I went to the oratory house, which is basically the rectory, and I knocked on the door, and this wizened old English priest opened the door, and he said, yeah, may I help you? And I said, I wish to become a Catholic. And he said, he didn't miss a beat. He said, very well, I shall instruct you. And so he was, yeah, then that's where I was received into the church. That's where I was instructed, yeah.
May everyone get that answer when he knocks on the door of the rectory. I hope so. Very well, and here we are.
Have you tried the mosque over there?
Little did he know you'd become the evangelist that you are too. Do talk about Benedict, and I don't actually hang out with popes often, but I did meet Benedict.
I've seen a photo, yes.
And I thanked him for Jesus of Nazareth.
Yes.
Because they are so important to
yes.
a cradle Catholic and to people who are trying to find a door into God. So how did he help you?
So in Jesus of Nazareth, I write in this memoir that it's the book to which I owe my soul and my salvation. It's a wonderful...
Only that.
Yes. It's a book that's written as a sort of Christian primer, and it's easier going than his... let's say his introduction of Christianity, which is sort of misaptly titled, inaptly titled, sorry. And first of all, if you think yourself an intellectual, and you think that faith is for the superstitious or the silly, you encounter Benedict, and you instantly, so he humbles you with his vast erudition and intelligence. He makes it very clear that the witness of the four evangelists is plausible. Not only plausible, but perfectly persuasive. Yes, they didn't have notepads and so forth, but the various discrepancies between the accounts can be reasonably explained. But most important, I was reading the Torah at the same time that I was reading Jesus of Nazareth, and he, I think, makes a very compelling case that the Bible just tells one story, that it begins with, the fall, and that, a loving God will constantly seek out his creation to the point of this just mind-blowing, scandalous idea that God then becomes a baby, and draws so near to his creation as to become one of us. This sort of one narrative arc across the two testaments, I thought was powerful. So. I think by the end of that book, I was willing to say, at least to myself, that I'm a believer. But what I would tell other people is, this stuff is beautiful. It's been very civilizing. Not that I believe it, of course, but it's beautiful, isn't it? That's for years I would say that.
And you write at some point in the book, you could have just gone on that way and seen some Caravaggios and appreciated Christianity yes. for what it was.
Yes.
But what was it that moment in the oratory where you just I can't go along like this?
That was a decisive moment that all that's best about the West bears the imprint of the Gospels, and all sorts of political things that we take for granted, the idea of human dignity, wouldn't work. Or would be deracinated, it would be separated from its roots if it weren't for the sort of biblical soil that sustains all that stuff. And so that was one intellectual moment where I said, okay, you can't say I appreciate these things, but not the thing that sustains them, not the underlying soil that sustains them. And then on the grace side of it, it was just, yes, the beauty of that mass that made me say, okay, intellectually I'm in, and I'm committed to this stuff intellectually. Why can't I just say that I'm also committed to the supernatural thing that's happening at the altar there? Yeah.
You've been itching. At one point, you said something about, and years later, you're 33 or 34 now?
I'm 34 now.
You're
Yes, I'm past
34
resurrection
now.
age.
So you're an old man now.
Yes.
You're so relatively young. Why have you been itching since before you converted to talk about it? Because I think maybe our first exchange was when shortly after that French priest.
Okay,
was
I can announce that.
executed.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So when I began that course of instruction with that priest at the Oratorian, I didn't intend to come out, so to speak, as a public Catholic.
And you were at this time were writing. You were a journalist at the Wall Street Journal.
I wasn't intending to come out, and certainly at least until not after I was baptized. But then something horrible happened 2 months in across the English Channel. This, as you'll remember, jihadists assailed a church in Normandy, and killed the priest, Father Jacques Hamel, while he was celebrating the Mass, and that made me say, okay, I have to react to this somehow. Because I was just moved by these pictures of this gentle, frail priest and the thought that he was been forced to his knees and had his throat slit. So, like any millennial, that meant I went to Twitter and I wrote a hashtag, kind of like Je suis Charlie of a few years earlier. I am Jacques Hamel. And oh, by the way, I should announce I'm becoming a Roman Catholic. And that tweet went viral. Thousands of people retweeted it. And then it made its way to Christian media and so on and so forth. But a lot of folks, because I had a relatively public profile already, they went to Wikipedia and looked me up, and they saw that I had been born in Iran, and they just sort of surmised that, this act had instantaneously converted a Muslim, and the headlines were like that,
It was like the perfect Fox News story. Well done.
Exactly, but it wasn't that, and I was so frustrated. I was like, because on the one hand, I don't want to somehow not be thankful or absolutely reverential toward Father Hamel's witness, literal witness, but on the other hand, that wasn't true, and so I felt like I had to set the record straight, because it was, it's not like as if I had been praying to Allah 5 times a day and then instantly, right. I was a complete atheist by the time I was 13, and then a Marxist and whatever. Islam had left very, very thin imprints on my mind, my soul. So the initial urge was just to set the record straight. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you also express that you want to save other young, angry men from the
or women, I don't know.
From the agony of being as lost and angry as you were.
Yes, and my ideal is that some 20-something, would read this, and it would save them the miseries that I had to go through. On the other hand, I have friends who tell me that, those miseries were a source of grace ultimately for me, and perhaps, in other words, it's odd to think that somehow I would have found a different path to the church had I maybe read Augustine, I don't know, at age 24.
Well, I'm struck by that. In the book, you talk about some of the books that were influential and what influence St. Augustine had. But St. Augustine had to go through his fair share of struggle and long years lost in
and his share of even the not yets.
Correct. Is it strange to be 34 and have written your spiritual memoir, when it's ongoing, right? Yes. Conversion is ongoing.
Yes.
How do you deal with that aspect of, people are holding you up as the, they used to publish Pope Ratzinger, Ignatius Press, and now you're, the perfect millennial Catholic. How do you deal with the fact that you're... Well, and as you and David were talking about me, I'm like, excuse me, Lent sinner, if they only knew. Because that's true, and people want to know that that lived Christianity is possible in the world today.
Yeah.
And so that's why they put you on a pedestal, you know?
Yeah.
But how do you deal with that, and how do
Yeah.
you keep yourself in check in the midst of your perfect conversion story?
Well, 2 points. One is, because I know it'll be in the audience, so I'll preempt it. One is that you're so young. I've been asked this question, and you've been a man of enthusiasms. Mm-hmm. You know, at 20 it was Marxism. At 22 it was this. How do you know this isn't? How do you know you won't revert to Islam, or how do you know whatever? And the answer is that there's a lot that I'm unsure of in life, still. About the future course that my life will take, what catastrophes lay ahead, or what happinesses lay ahead. But one thing I know is I want a priest at my deathbed. You know, and hopefully it won't be a scene like Brideshead. But you know, I mean, hopefully I won't have fallen away and then suddenly do the sign of the cross. But at any rate, that I desperately want a priest at my deathbed. The way now to answer the actual question that you asked is, it is difficult because I keep recounting the conversion story, and I'm beginning to, as I said before we came on, I'm coming to appreciate the actor's art of being as excited about saying a line on the 50th occasion as on the first, and there's a real risk there as well when you sort of talk about faith, it dissipates. Right. You know,
or you're so busy talking about faith
that you don't actually live it.
Right.
So this Lent has been great for me. I mean, all the practices of having a spiritual director, which I'm happy to have, of living in New York, which means that the Blessed Sacrament and all the other sacraments are just there anytime I want, has been very very helpful to me. And then we were mentioning this as well. There's a kind of humility that comes after you convert. In my case, where when I had just converted, I had memorized a few prayers in Latin, and I'd read a few important books, and I thought, I know so much about the faith.
I've got this now.
And then I could be like, oh, the Pope is introducing doctrinal instability, like as though and the longer I go, the more I read, the more I'm like, oh my goodness, the library of Catholic faith and ideas is so vast that it humbles you, and so some things I won't do, like I will now steer clear as much as I can of inter-ecclesial debates about theology and so forth. Now, as a journalist, my vocation, I will mention things that are within my purview, if you will, like my vocation. The abuse scandal I'll comment on. But there are certain things where I've learned to just pray, and obey, and it feels good.
And you, even though you're a good millennial who has a Twitter account, you don't have to comment on everything, and you can leave a pause. I don't. Which we don't seem to think is plausible. And I've never seen so many canon lawyers as I do on Twitter.
Yes.
It obviously is a weird time in the church to be talking about the faith so openly, and people do expect you to have answers. How have you, besides what you just said, how have you been able to be humble and you have a pretty sober demeanor on, you can give pointed analysis, but you're sober, and an adult in some of these when things start to frenzy. How have you decided to do that? Because you've obviously made a conscious decision, and why? Is it in part to sort of help avoid scandal? Try to help. Are you trying to help fellow Christians too?
Bottom line, I have faith in our Lord's promise to St. Peter, and that means a certain degree of docility to Peter and his collaborators, including the ones we have now, who are as the apostles were. They were men, and they make mistakes and so forth. But I just have that sort of.
They have been men since the beginning.
Yes, and I have that sort of bedrock confidence in the promise, but also a kind of realistic sense of human nature. I mean, the Christian anthropology is not naive. It begins with the fall. Before we know anything about Adam, almost, and Eve, they mess it up. you know, and that means that a divinely founded institution can be peopled with flawed people, and so I think that helps me. And yeah, I do try to, because the way we have so many disorders in the world, and the disorders of the world can infect how we think about the church, and I try to keep those two separate, that it's a different kind of institution, and not every kind of critique that works in a liberal democracy, for example, works in a church.
Right.
This is not a liberal democracy, and so that kind of election mentality is very harmful, I think, so I try to not get into it.
I do remember when it's actually the anniversary of Pope Francis's election, and I remember being over there, and people had their playing card kind of lists about
Team Sohrab.
Exactly. Little bio sketches on who were the most likely candidates, and it was like watching the primaries for a presidential election. And at a certain point, I'd be like, all right, enough. This is not how it works. And what you mentioned, all the opportunities for the sacraments in New York City. What I love is you have, so arguably the more conservative church, St. Agnes by Grand Central Station, and arguably a more liberal St. Francis Assisi by Penn Station, both have Eucharistic adoration all day. Both have lots of confession hours, and it is almost sort of the healing work that needs to happen, where we depoliticize stuff in the church, and I think you're helping with that as well, and in the demeanor you've chosen to take on Twitter and in your writing about these things. So thank you for doing that. You write movingly about Teresa of Avila and some other saints. What was your experience of getting to know them? And obviously you still are. I'm a cradle Catholic and I still am. But who's jumped out at you, and how? What does your relationship to them look like?
I would say first of all, I think that the communion of saints is one of the things about Catholicism that you don't really understand, including its sort of across three dimensions, the purgatory and here on earth and in heaven, that you don't really understand until it is this great family, and it's been wonderful to.
You won't see the full picture until
there's
later.
One of the priests, I can't remember, at St. Patrick who just does, every time he does a daily mass homily, which obviously has to be short, he just gives you a capsule biography of the saints, and every time there's someone new. But I would say the modern saints have really been very important to me. Saint Josemaria Escrivá, Saint Maximilian Kolbe, Saint John Paul II, because obviously they're so close to us in time that, and because a lot of, in the first half of my talk, I sort of have at least some taste of the horrors of the 20th century, at least on the tail end of them, of sort of modern revolutionary horrors, and so that the witness of people like John Paul II, of Saint Maximilian Kolbe, is tangible to me, right? Of facing down political evil. Yeah.
Was it hard to sit down and realize that you had to talk about things about your family, and that maybe you didn't want to have to? Why did you think it was important to that? Is that part of the authenticity, so that somebody picks it up and can relate to it?
Partly, I also just wanted to tell a good story. And when I started writing, I had no sense that I was disclosing so much, as you learn if you buy the book, about myself. So I was just wanted to tell a good story. If I were a journalist and writing about someone else, I would look for those things that stand out about a life. And it's never the pleasant stuff. It's never the easy stuff. It's the sort of extraordinary things. So as a journalist, you do that. And so I was doing that about my own life. It didn't hit me until the book was gallied up. And then I was like, oh my goodness. Potentially everyone in the world knows this about me or knows that about me. Oddly enough, I haven't. Look, I was worried. What would people I know who've known me as just as editorial writer, blah, blah, blah. Suddenly, like, would they sneer, you know, having known what I was like as a teenager or something? And not really. I mean, no one's been like that. I think people are more charitable than that. And that was my fear, but it hasn't panned out. I don't know.
Gosh, if anyone doesn't have something you don't want to necessarily
Yes,
have in a
yes,
book,
yes,
you know,
yes.
I certainly hope we would be more merciful than that. I want people to be more merciful. I think maybe we'll start taking some questions. And is there a microphone? Is it in the back? So maybe raise your hand if you have questions.
Oh, good.
Okay. Yeah, I figured we had questions. Oh, right here in the middle. Sorry.
Yep, thank you. You mentioned Pope Benedict, and I know this came very early in your story, or maybe even predated it, but his lecture at Regensburg. Partly I want to know what you think of it now. I assume you read that. And then also, do you think it had any impact in the Muslim world? I don't mean to make you speak for the Muslim world, but did it penetrate in any way? I'm curious to know.
Well, it set off literal fires. That was in 2005, and that was when I was in Teach for America. And I don't think I thought about it maybe as a news story, and then it sort of flashed away. And as it happens, I was asked to give a talk at the Thomistic Institute, Does Politics Need God? And then I went back and read it. And now I think it's the most prophetic, one of the most prophetic modern papal addresses, and also most misunderstood. I mean, most people took it as a crude harangue against Islam, when it's anything but. It's more directed at the West's, let's say, scientistic tendencies, this tendency that the only questions worth asking are the ones with empirical, technical, scientific ones. You know, really only how questions, but no why questions. And the narrowing, that therefore, if those are the only questions worth asking in public, then faith, all faith, doesn't belong in the public square. It's only a sort of purely subjective matter of your feelings, and it's not something about which you can reason. When, of course, you know, the Catholic faith, the Christian faith, is, as he points out, is rooted in a God who is reason himself. In the beginning was the Logos, which means, again, this is not me saying so, but Pope Benedict says so in the document, which means word, but it also means reason. In the beginning was reason. Which means that the sort of the Hellenic dimension of Christianity is not some imposition on it or something that happened just randomly because that it was providential, that Christianity would emerge in this soil that was already fertile for reason, and therefore the two are very much married. And the fact that we have now moved toward a stage towards ever more de-Hellenization of Christianity is the tragedy he's decrying. And it's so unfortunate that both because the Vatican, as you know, did a bad job in the initial English translation, where Pope Benedict quoted this Byzantine emperor, Manuel II Palaiologos, who said, show me what Muhammad's wrought, and anything that's new, and I'll tell you it's all horror. And I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the exact quote. But the initial English translation missed out the part that Benedict, the prefatory remark that Benedict added, which says that the emperor spoke with a brusqueness which means in his royal we, find unacceptable, utterly unacceptable, or something like that. The initial English translation was missing that. Religious reporters in the US and across Europe are so illiterate, they also didn't understand the speech. And of course, Islamist preachers love to abuse things. And so it turned out into this caricature of something. I see it more as a critique of Western modernity than it is of Islam. Yeah, I hope that helps.
You were just over with Pope Francis in Abu
Dhabi, yeah.
What was that like, and why did you think it was important to go over?
Oh, it was an extraordinary trip because I thought it didn't get nearly enough attention as it should have. The first pope in more than 2,000 years visiting the Arabian Peninsula, not far from where Muhammad declared his new faith. So that was just in itself was just such a historic thing, and I thought everyone. Second of all, I think he celebrated, again, one of the most consequential masses of modern times. It was, which I was lucky to go. It was in a stadium in Abu Dhabi with 120,000 people, 50,000 inside, 70,000 outside watching on jumbotrons, and those people were primarily, the Arab world salt of the earth. The Nigerian medical worker, the Filipina cleaning lady, people who, in the way that these Gulf societies work, are not even looked at. They're sort of just serve a function, and no one, and they certainly have no political rights or anything. And suddenly the Pope comes and says, these people have a Holy Father who cares for their souls. There's a dignity that, and then it was broadcast across the Middle East. Who knows what sort of evangelical effect it had when people in Saudi Arabia tune in and watch a mass, or they look into their Twitter, wherever it is. And the third point I just want to mention was that the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, which is the most important Sunni institution, and the Pope spoke side by side in front of very sort of Emirati dignitaries. And both of them picked up Regensburg-like themes. Both of them critiqued, again, this individualism, scientism, utilitarianism, a worldview that narrows the scope of moral questions that you can ask. And it relegates morality, faith, these things to a sort of private sphere, and is this utilitarian worldview. So I wrote a piece for the Catholic Herald, just saying that in a way it was a vindication of the Regensburg address as well. Yeah.
If you hadn't gone over there, it would have been a total footnote over here. Why do you think that is, that we didn't pay much attention to it?
I was in a junket, and lots of people covered it for other mainstream outlets, but not from the faith angle, right, as often happens. So, it's like, did Francis push enough about reform in the Emirates? And it's like, him saying, I don't know, do this and that, that's not gonna, he has what I think is sort of millennial or half a millennial vision of evangelization. Mm-hmm. So celebrating a mass in the Arab world, in the heartland of Islam, means so much more than being like right, raising policy points. Right. Again, that policy points is the mindset of a very technocratic, scientistic society, mm-hmm, and that's the only things that can notice about a trip like that is right, the technocratic. Do you feel a little bit like a missionary over here, reminding us of what's most important?
I that is why I think memoirs like this, even when your conversion is so fresh, are important, because there is an earnestness, there's a joy, mm-hmm, that comes out that's important to remind people of. You're supposed to be joyful about this stuff if you really believe it, Well, my mission with the book and its publicity, has been to A, set the record straight about the thing we talked about with Father Hamel, and B, to just tell a good story. If there's a missionary dimension to it, it's secondary. Yes. Yeah. Other questions? One in the back there.
I just wanted to say you were a very convincing atheist. I said, where is this book going? But what I wanted to ask you is, how did your family react to all of this?
Oh, that's a good question. So my family, unlike a lot of stories of conversion from the Muslim world, where the family, is like, we've disowned him, if he ever comes home, get beheaded or something. My family, as I said, we're children of 1968. My parents were Bohemians, so the only moral commandment that my father ever handed down to me was, be yourself. They encouraged me to call them by their first names because mother and father and ma and pa was sort of redolent of tradition and authority, which they didn't like. So that's the kind of parents I had. So at worst, in my family, there was indifference, and at best, certainly welcoming. So, nothing terrible. Nothing terrible, yeah.
There were some questions in the middle, too. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Other questions?
This
In
way,
the-
middle.
You are very supportive of the Pope. I follow you on Twitter.
Yeah.
And you talked about maybe some of the other popes being much more traditionally religious or spiritual in their teachings, and this Pope seems to get involved in political stuff. How do you rationalize that aspect of him in today's world, given the divisiveness of the world we live in?
I would say that, first of all, it's worth listening to him more than I think some of his critics do. So I just reviewed his book on the Ave Maria, just came out a week ago from Image, and it's profoundly spiritual. It's a glimpse into his Marian devotion, and and again, I see more continuity in his constant critiques of individualism, scientism, utilitarianism. He constantly rails against an elite that doesn't have a sense of needs for human attachment, of people who basically can jet set anywhere, and that in Western context can play as a kind of left critique, but I don't think it really is, and I think it's in deeper continuity with both Pope Benedict and John Paul II than people think. So I don't think it's true that he's not. What I will say is, I did go to a general audience in 2017, and it was devoted. I mean, his homily was devoted to a labor dispute between unions and bosses in Italy. I sort of felt like, I was hoping for something else. I'll be honest. But
then some of the things.
But then some of the things that he writes the book, and it's
Right.
Yeah.
And some of the things that he says are sort of conveniently covered. In some cases, it's just not a sexy topic that
Like
he's
that
talking
one,
about,
yes,
so
yes.
so it won't make headlines. But then he talks about, during an audience, abortion being like hiring a hitman, and
Yes,
that doesn't
a
make
hitman
headlines
with a glove,
in the same way.
Or his constant railing against gender ideology,
Right.
which both his sort of critics, I suppose, on the Catholic right don't emphasize enough, and obviously kind of mainstream liberal media would also like to downplay.
Right. There's a real poverty to, and you were talking about this earlier, a real poverty to our reactions
Yeah.
to things that happen in the church often.
Yes.
And I think he's such a key example. I remember when his encyclical on ecology came out, I read it and I thought, this is such a huge opportunity for common ground. He's talking about creation, all of creation, including man and woman and marriage. And so there was this opportunity to sort of take the so-called, social justice left and the pro-life right, who are all part of the same church and should be talking about all the same issues, and introduce them to one another, So
that's one of the things that I'm now interested in is, I think Ross Douthat talks about it as the revival of a real Catholic center. That's critical of the sort of, again, exhausting kind of soulless tendencies of modernity, and it means that people of the traditional left and right can meet in this new place where there's this fresh critique that is the church. The way the church really looks at modernity is a lot more interesting, I think, than saying, "Oh, he's an environmentalist," or what have you.
Right.
Yeah.
It's harder work because you can't fall back on categories.
Yes.
but
And you're not
it's
comfortable
important
in either partisan camp.
Correct, exactly. I remember Archbishop Chaput saying years ago that if you had asked him in the 1960s which party would become the party that defends legal abortion, he would have never said the Democrats, because it was filled with Catholics. And whether you're Republican or Democrat, Catholics don't fight for these things like they should, because we do the more comfortable thing. We didn't want to stick our necks out. And, there were some questions in the front, I thought, or one there in the back. We'll come to you next, in the back, and then.
Thank you so much for the moving talk. Your portrait of Yossi, your Teach for America roommate, is very rich and very enlightening in terms of its role in your own odyssey. Mm-hmm. I don't know this for sure. I'm going to just take a stab at this and say that Yossi was probably a secular Israeli.
Yes, he was.
Okay, so knowing that, what has been your engagement or encounter with the living Jewish tradition?
Yes.
And how has that been a part of or distinct from your own journey to the Catholic faith?
So first of all, for me, although he was a thoroughly secular Israeli, he still kept, let's say, the high holidays, right? And that left some mark on me, the fact that we mark this out this time of the year for God and we don't eat certain things. That was there's a presence there, in that sort of refusal to go along with daily life. At some points you break. But then with, my own reading, obviously I mentioned reading the Torah. I read Robert Alter's translation, which is magnificent. Now he's done the whole Hebrew Bible, but at the time it was just the first 5 books of Moses. And with the 5 books of Moses, and that was very important to me. There were lots of, I would say, secular or secularish Jews who, oddly enough, brought me to Catholicism. Is a paradoxical thing to say. One would be Arthur Koestler, shook me out of my college Marxism. And if you remember in Darkness at Noon, the Rubashov character, who's this Communist Party apparatchik, who is now being tried, having been fallen out of favor with essentially Stalin, although he's barely referred to him as that. And he's looking back at his life, and the conclusion that he comes to, spoiler alert, he sort of says, perhaps man needed the steadying brakes of thou shalt not. But also he thinks back to a Pietà, to a scene of the Blessed Virgin holding the dying Jesus, and that somehow moves him too. And so it's like the 10 Commandments and the dying Jesus, for him, are a bulwark against totalitarianism. So in that sense, Arthur Koestler made me see that not only is Christianity not an oppressive force, or let's say the Judeo-Christian tradition, not an oppressive force, it's a bulwark against political totalitarianism. Because if you have, if you're bound to an absolute other, you won't treat the other with a small o as a nothing that you can crush. Leo Strauss was enormously influential. As you know, Strauss has a very complicated religion with Christianity and Catholicism in particular. But his critique of relativism at the beginning of Natural Right and History, which demolishes in a few sentences the idea that just because there are many opinions about the truth, it means there's no truth. That was very important to me, right? Because our whole age essentially comes down to the view that there are many views about the truth, therefore there can't be one thing that's true. And he just says, well, why not? And if the former view is correct, why not cannibalism? Really? And he says the only thing, if that's true, then the only thing that's keeping us from practicing cannibalism is just force of habit. So there were these Jews who oddly pointed me to my ultimate, and I wrote a piece about it for commentary. I don't know if you remember, yeah. And Natan Sharansky, but then I'm going on too long. Anyway.
Lady in red has the last word.
My question is a light one. Having entered the Catholic Church at the Brompton Oratory, have you visited the Brooklyn Oratory?
I have not. I've visited the Birmingham and the Vienna.
Visit Brooklyn.
I should.
So that's what we have time for, but I'd just actually like to end with one question. Being an art center,
Yes.
You've spoken in your talk, in your questions, and even upstairs about the role of beauty in your conversion. As an art center that's also a project of the Archdiocese of New York that has sort of a mandate for evangelizing, can you talk a little bit about, sometimes we tend to think about faith in too intellectual a way, not to dismiss the rich intellectual tradition of the church, but could you talk a little bit about the role of beauty?
Mm-hmm. I think it's very important. I think, for me, one of the things that made me ultimately say at that Mass at the Oratory that that's it, I've been flirting with Catholicism long enough, I'm going to become a Roman Catholic, was the way that the altar represents the sort of Trinitarian glories, right, of the Blessed Virgin, of Saint Philip Neri, who's sort of kneeling, wrapped before the Virgin, and then up there's God the Father and a dove. That's up there, and then your eyes start down there, but then they come down, and then there's a crucifix, and then further down there's the tabernacle, and then the Blessed Sacrament, and so obviously at your eye level it says that those glories above, those divine glories above, meet you at this human level below, here, in the sacrament. So the reasoning that went through my mind is if there is a God, which I said yes there is, there's a personal God, yes there is, and if we notice him through our imagination, that must be because he wants us. So this idea that, this very sort of Puritan Calvinist idea that churches should be bare and so forth is contrary to God's nature. He's created us for beauty, among other things. So why would he want, worship to be barren? So it's very important, and I'm very grateful that so happy to now engage in the Sheen Center's work now that it's here. Yeah.
And I was in the chapel, the Blessed Sacraments here in the chapel, and there's this beautiful mother and child icon that is here for a couple of months, I believe. And I'd seen it for the first time in person when I popped in earlier, and I was just struck by exactly what you're saying. The image there just draws you deeper into the life of faith in a way that if it wasn't there, it was just striking to me. As you were talking, it's exactly what I experienced earlier here. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for writing your book, which you will sign copies of. And thank you to the Sheen Center for putting on events like this.